You really got a ceiling in here too, doesn't it? I mean,
well, the builder did this.
High ceiling.
Well, you're being recorded right now. So.
Oh.
Yeah. When we came back from Copenhagen, the builder built us this.
Oh.
Interview with William K. Dyer, August 9th, 1988. I guess, Bill, why don't you give me a little bit of your background as far as the industry is concerned? When did you first get involved in the industry, and what did you do?
Well, I graduated from the University of Kentucky in 1938 and went to work for the Buffalo Forge Company in Buffalo, New York as an engineer in training to eventually go out and get in sales work in a branch office. And I stayed with it until until I quit. 1969, I retired.
Okay, and your father also worked for Buffalo Forge, you had mentioned.
Yes, he also went to the University of Kentucky. He graduated in 1904, and he went to work at the Buffalo Forge Company, and he stayed there till he died. He was sales manager by the time I was an adult, and that's what he stayed as until he intended to retire, but at 65, but they asked him to stay on because World War II was on, and they couldn't have done.
Okay, well, as far as your father is concerned, what do you recall about the type of work he did, or is there anything interesting you can tell us about his career?
Well, he got a degree in mechanical engineering at the University of Kentucky, and they were in, of course, the Buffalo Forge Company, made forges first, and the reason they got into blowers was that the forge had a little hand-turned blower wheel, and one time somebody asked them to build some kind of a little blower, and the first thing you know, they were in the blower business, and as forges became unnecessary, well, they got into air handling equipment and heating and cooling, humidifying, dehumidifying, cleaning, and whatnot. And as air conditioning came in, they got into that, of course.
How much did your father have to do with the heating, ventilating, air conditioning side of the business?
Well, that's the only side he was ever in. They were already into that, I guess, pretty well. Of course, I don't know. I wasn't born until 10 years after he went there. But I guess they were into air conditioning, or not air conditioning. They were into heating and ventilating by that time. And he worked as an engineer for a while and then became sales manager, and he stayed with that.
And what was his association with Willis Carrier?
Well, I don't know where they met, but I think Willis Carrier was there about 2 or 3 years before my father, which would have been 1901 or so. And he was chief engineer. I don't think they had anybody else in engineering at the time, probably. It was a small company, I'm sure. And they shared a desk. They used, the whole office was like that. They had these 5-foot square yellow oak desks, and on each side there was a knee hole and drawers, and they were the same one, sales manager and chief engineer. And of course they were looking at each other from 5 feet away all day. So, and they lived just about 2 blocks apart, so they knew each other pretty well, of course. As chief engineer, Mr. Carrier developed a psychrometric chart about, I don't know when, along in that period, maybe in the teens. And he got quite interested in air conditioning, and he finally decided he'd like to go off and start his own company and get into that field. And they didn't want him to go because they didn't think he could make a living at it, and it wasn't accepted, of course. I mean, air conditioning was unheard of for residential or anything like that. It was maybe for a printer that needed something for matching paper. It'd have to have the same temperature and humidity and that sort of thing. But he persevered, and they made a deal with him that he'd have to buy the first $1 million worth of fans, if he used any, from the Buffalo Forge Company. And they knew that was enough that he'd never buy them from anybody else. And in those days, $1 million was a lot of money. And also that he would come back once a year and put in a couple of days advising their engineering department, which he did, of course. And he was gone by the time he was in his own business. I don't know when they started the Carrier Company, but it must have been somewhere in the late teens, I'd say 1918 or so maybe. I don't know exactly when. He wanted my father to go with him, but my father wasn't that adventurous. He figured they'd never make any money at it. You know, the funny thing was, he was right. If he had gone with him, they wouldn't have had much success, because my father died before they really got going. And that was after World War II, when they really started to go big. I know the stock was, my father had bought some of it, and it wasn't all that hot either. Of course, he died in, let's see, 1945, when the war was still on.
Well then, as far as Willis Carrier is concerned, how long did you know him yourself?
Well, I remember as a child, I lived on Russell, which was a block from Amherst, and he lived another block down the street, so about a block and a half away, and they had a social life between the two families, and I knew him that way as just one of my parents' friends, Mr. and Mrs. Carrier. I can't remember if that was his second or third wife at that time, but she died, and whoever it was, and he married he had 3 wives and survived them all, so it was either the second or third one, I think. I didn't know them other than just to see them as Mrs. Carrier, of course.
And what, you of course, I guess recall some interesting things about him as a person and everything.
Well, he was a very friendly type of person. A very common type of guy. I mean, anybody would walk up and talk to him. He had no airs at all about him. But he was, you could tell he was really brilliant as an engineer. And of course, he was always asked to make talks here and there. But he could never stay on the subject. He would wander off on a tangent and then another tangent, and nobody cared because he was interesting no matter what he talked about. He was a good speaker, but he just couldn't stay on the subject. I remember that about him, and he was interested in people. The Buffalo Forge Company, when I was first there, had all the engineers sitting on high stools, drafting type stools, on a slanty drawing board, and he'd come over and pull up the stool and sit and talk with you about engineering for a while, and first thing you know, he'd be off on something else, but he stayed in the field at least. But I mean, he wouldn't be on the subject that he started on, and you'd always learn something. I never could figure out how he developed the psychrometric chart. At that time, it was quite an accomplishment to get all these different factors on the same page. And of course, we got a lot of them like that ever since, I guess. But I remember his first, I think the Carrier Company's first job was air conditioning, I guess they call it, a printing plant. And it worked fine, because they always had trouble with it, especially in the summer, I guess, with the good printing matching up from one day to the next. The paper would shrink or expand overnight, or the humidity would change, and it wouldn't match up with what they'd printed, say, the day before when they were trying to put things together. And they didn't have any more trouble when he got the system working. And so all of a sudden, all of the big printing companies around the United States wanted to have air-conditioned shops. And I think that was their first place. Then they got into theaters, I believe, next. And about the only air conditioning back in the pre-war that I knew of was in air conditioning. I mean, in the theaters, which are almost all movies. They had the little vaudeville was still going. But usually each city had about one of those, and the rest were movies. I think the war kind of interrupted air conditioning anyway, and it didn't really get moving until up in the mid-40s. I don't know what you asked me now.
Oh, well, I was really asking about Carrier and
Yeah.
Him as a person, some of the things you remember about him, some of the interesting things that he did, and so on.
I remember he called me Billy. Nobody else ever did. I don't remember whether he had a family or his children. They were older enough that I wouldn't have known them, I guess. So I just knew him and Mrs. Carrier. But as a kid, I didn't pay much attention. He was just another person, of course, at the time, you know. You could know the president and you wouldn't pay much attention when you're 5, 6 years old.
Did you continue any type of association with him, friendship-wise or anything, after he left Buffalo Forge and established his own company?
Well, only when he came over from Syracuse to do his engineering deal each year. I was there, I guess, probably twice when he did that. And he knew who I was, of course, so he'd talk to me, but he tried to make it about the same as the others so it wouldn't look funny. We had about 17 engineers in those days, and they were all young fellows. And he would talk to the chief engineer and assistant chief engineer, and then just sort of walk around and chat with the other people. He's put in a day or two, as I remember. And he enjoyed it, apparently. I think he enjoyed everything he did, really.
I want to interrupt something.
Do you remember any interesting stories about Carrier that you know you yourself were familiar with, or your father may have told you? Anything about him? Some of the things that you don't read in the history books about him.
I really don't. Most of their friendship, the two families, was when I was real small and before he had left Buffalo to go to Syracuse, New York with his company. So when I was older enough to remember these things, he was not really over very much from Syracuse to Buffalo, I mean, and I saw him only occasionally then. And, I really don't remember much. Of course, I knew what he looked like, and it's surprising. I just don't remember much after I was about, maybe 8 years old, until I was doing engineering work and knew him then as he was older, of course, and I don't know, he must have been up in his 60s or so, maybe 70. And I was in my early 20s. Heard a lot about him, but that wouldn't be anything that everybody else didn't know, I'm sure.
What did you hear about him?
Well, he had trouble with the company. I guess he was a terrific engineer, and I don't know that he was all that big as a salesman. I think he had a fellow named Thornton Lewis that used to be with the Buffalo Forge Company, and he went over to work on sales, I think. And
Logan Lewis?
Thornton.
Thornton.
Yeah. And his son and I were in college together. Thornton Lewis Jr., and I think he went to work with Carrier. But they were a pretty big company by the time the early 30s came around, I guess. I don't know how big, but they were well known. But I just didn't see him an awful lot after I was a boy, really. One of the dean of engineering college at University of Kentucky was F. Paul Anderson, and as pertains to ASHRAE, they had an award named after him, the F. Paul Anderson Award, obviously. I haven't seen it lately. Maybe they renamed it, but I knew him pretty well. He used to come to Buffalo with from Kentucky with a senior class of engineers to visit some of the industrial areas. They didn't have much of that in Kentucky, Lexington. And I think he visited Detroit and Buffalo and maybe other places with this group. Of course, there wasn't a very big group in those days. The senior class of mechanicals would be maybe a dozen or something like that. And he would stay overnight with us because he and my father knew each other pretty well. And when I went to the university, he was still there, but he died after I was a freshman. I think I had 1 year before he had died. I remember he was about 5'2" and kind of chubby and a very nice person. And everybody knew him. I guess he was the president of a national of ASHV, we called it, ASHV. I went to a lot of conventions with my father, I suppose, probably 6 or 8 summer annual conventions with ASHV. And he was the president of the local chapter at Buffalo, but he didn't get into, well, I guess he was on the national nominating committee, that's right. And he nominated some pretty good men I think two of them were Carrier and Anderson, and was a fellow that wrote a textbook. I can't recall his name. It was a classic of its day, and I suppose it's out of date by now. He was one of the presidents in that era. One of the other men on the committee was Kirk Campbell from Kansas City. And my father's name was also Kirk, K-I-R-K. So they were about the same size and shape and the same name, and they got to know each other pretty well. And they both had a son named Kirk. I'm one of them. That's my middle name. And like Kirk Campbell used to, I don't know where he is now, but I guess he's still in town. I haven't seen him in years. I'm running out of memory, I guess.
Were there any other, people that you got to know in the industry, that were fairly famous within the industry for one reason or another?
Heating and ventilating, you mean, and air conditioning?
Yeah.
Of course, I knew everybody in the Buffalo Forge Company, and they were pioneers in that field. I don't know if they were very well known, but Bill Heath was the assistant chief engineer at the Buffalo Forge Company, and I think he was a pioneer, but I don't know that he'd be remembered now. Funny thing, he went from assistant chief engineer to president of the company in one step because a fellow named Al Cricky was the chief engineer at the time, and he was a good engineer, but he never finished anything past high school. And Bill Heath was a graduate of, I think, Cornell, and he was a better engineer than Mr. Cricky, but he didn't want to hurt his feelings. So he took a bigger salary, but I guess the old man didn't know it. And he just served as assistant chief engineer. He's really running the company pretty much. So when the time came, they made him president, and it seemed normal. He was the guy to do the job. I don't know if Mr. Cricky was known in his field. I think he was, though, because he was a pioneer in, well, I guess Mr. Carrier developed the backward inclined blade blower, and I think the curved blade too, and the double curved blade, S-shaped, because they had, as you may know, power characteristics which were very desirable, and pressure characteristics. And actually, a double curved blade is, of course, a lot stronger than the flat laid back blade, which has a tendency to belly out at high speed. So you had to build a very heavy blade to keep from bending. Then you had to build a heavy back plate and flanges to hold it, and first thing you know, you had too much weight. So that's why you developed the curved blades. Mr. Heath, I think Bill Heath, was involved in that, along with Al Cricky. And I guess they were also involved in the elementary air conditioning that they were doing. When, of course, Carrier probably in charge of it. Before he left, he was, of course, chief engineer. And he was interested in anything to do with air, but obviously air conditioning air cooling was one of the things. And he could see ahead that was going to be tremendous. But it was very slow developing. And I think World War II held it up about 5 years probably. I know when I got here, the department stores hadn't been air conditioned yet. And weren't until, I guess, 1950 or so. I've wandered off again.
No, that's fine. No, the things that you were saying were interesting.
I think Roger Campbell is still a member then. Roger was Kirk Campbell's younger brother, as I recall, and he took over the company. They, like a lot of brothers, didn't see eye to eye on a few things, and I think Kirk went off as a manufacturer's agent on his own, and Roger took over the company when E. Kirk Campbell, his father, retired or died. I know Kirk used to come around to meetings for a long time. I don't remember his last year here, but he lived to be quite old here.
Did your son go to school out of K-State, Kirk?
Yeah, and he went to school with your son.
Yeah, did you get involved in any of the K-State activity?
Well, they...
Educational labs and things?
No, they started the crew, though, you know, the 8-man rowing crew. They were the first ones in the Big 8 to have a crew. And my son was interested in that, and he was a little fellow named Rose was the, I think his name was Rose, was the coach. And this was unofficial. The university did not recognize them, and they got no letters and no money. So they were pretty poor, and some of the fathers and whatnot gave money to buy the boats and the oars and that sort of thing. And they came over here several years and had meets with some of the bigger schools right here in Johnson County on Shawnee Mission Park Lake, which wasn't really long enough. I think they got 1,000 meters in. But they had Alabama and, let's see, I can't remember, but some of the Big Ten and one of the Ivy Leagues at one time came in here in the first maybe 3 years that they were rowing. Of course, they were on a river, but it wasn't all that good. And then when the lake came in, they were on the reservoir there. It got pretty good-sized waves, though. So I think those little babies don't take too much of a wave successfully. I know they sank a few times.
Did you know Ralph Nevins pretty well?
Yeah, he died quite young, though. I thought, what, about 45 or something? Yeah, he used to come over here to meetings, I guess every meeting, just about, and he would talk occasionally, and he brought a bunch of K-State engineer students in. Sometimes a pretty good-sized crowd, I mean 20s maybe, and they were a student chapter, I'm sure. But before that, we had a KU chapter, student chapter. And for 1 year, I was the lucky chapter advisor that got to go over to the meetings. And they came over here too, but they weren't as big as K-State. I think maybe a dozen at the height, maybe 20 at the height of their... there wasn't very many years, maybe 5 years they operated. I think they're back in the business though. Haven't we got one at KU again? They never did. Oh. I know they were the only ones, they were at K-State at it, but there was 2 or 3 of them that were very interested in ASHRAE, and when they left, I guess the student interest faded at KU, which is a lot handier for a student advisor to go over.
Was there anything else interesting from a historical standpoint that you recall about, you know, your early days with the industry or anything?
Well, when I got out of the Army in, let's see, 45, after the war, well after the war, I guess it was, I couldn't get out. I came out here, I went back to the Buffalo Forge Company for a short training period to see what had happened while I was gone. And I came out here to reopen the office, which they'd closed at the time the war started. Our man here was drafted. And so they had no one here for 4 or 5 years. And I remember at the first couple of meetings I met, let's see, Carl Clegg, who was the American blower representative, and one of the nicest guys you'd ever meet, and he sponsored me as a member of ASHRAE. And I was a funny thing. I rented an office in the Dwight building on the 3rd floor. And the first day I was there, I walked around. The hall was a circle, and I walked around and looked at see who all was on the floor. There's American blowers right around the corner from me, about 50 feet away, of all the places in town. And Ted Harriman had just started working with Carl Clegg, and when Carl was forced to retire at 65, I guess, Ted Harriman took over the office, and then later he was, shortly after that, he's promoted to national sales manager. But he didn't like it and came back here. And of course, Carl went with the boiler company, and they didn't have a retirement requirement at 65, and I think he stayed with them about 15 years, didn't he? The same company owned it, but they had a different arrangement on retirement ages. I think he did as well with the boilers as he ever did with the blowers. He was just the worst possible salesman, you know. He was so good and everybody liked him so much. He was the worst competition you could have. You go to lunch with a guy and then he'd beat your ears off at 2 o'clock. He knew everybody, and everybody liked him. He was a hard worker. He always took a bag of stuff home with him at night, and God, he was tough competition. Yeah, we used to get out and have coffee together at Vi's in the first floor there. Right here in town, I remember there was only one engineer. It was Bill Castle, and he had all the business except I can't remember the name of the fellow he worked for before the war, and then left to start his own company. But he quit about 1946 or 47. As far as I know, Castle was the only engineer in town. It seemed like everybody that was here later had worked for Bill and took off and started their own. But he had all the business. So you had to get along with him and get him to specify some of your material if you wanted to sell anything. I guess Bill's still, is he still working, you know?
His name's there, but no, he's retired. But
Yeah.
his name is there.
I remember he told me
Hubert Smith, I believe.
yeah, his father lived to be, I think, he was 92 or 98 or something, and I thought at the time, it looks like he's going to do the same, because he looked about the same 40 years after I first saw him. I remember he was, one time he took a trip over to Japan for several weeks, I think, and this is 20 years ago perhaps, and I went in to go to lunch with Paul Marino, and I was sitting there waiting when Paul was finishing up something, and Bill saw me and he says, "Hey, come on in and talk a while." And I guess he didn't eat, or I don't know, for some reason he wasn't going to go to lunch. He got so interesting, I sat there 40 minutes while Paul was waiting, and he told me about his trip to Japan. But the one thing I remembered was, and boy was he right, he says, "You know, Bill, they're going to bury us in the next 20, 30 years. He knew about their work ethics and how efficient they were, and he could see it coming. And boy, was he right. Huh? I guess there wasn't anything we could do about it.
Bill, did you know Leon Marks?
Oh yeah, I remember when I first went to the few meetings. They were meeting in the balcony of the old Union Station, and we had 25 in attendance. Would be a good month, and Leon Mart was one of the 25, and let's see. Well, he was just one of the boys. I guess the company was pretty good size then. I don't know. This is back in the late 40s, but of course he got a lot bigger. But he was a very nice person to have in a meeting, and everybody seemed to be real chummy and talk together. And he was, you know, with 3 tables of people, you'd get to know each other pretty well. I was just a young kid compared to some of those fellows, but he was there and very active. Funny thing, Bill Castle had been a past president, and I started going to meetings pretty faithfully in 1947, and until about 35 or 40 years later, I never saw him at a meeting. I remember just a few years ago, he was invited as I don't know what they're going to give him, a presentation, I guess, and I told him, well, this is the first time I've ever seen you at a meeting. He wasn't real happy with that, but I've been here 35 years, never seen him. But I guess, like a lot of past presidents, he got burned out maybe and didn't go back. Seemed like that was the usual deal for past presidents, with the exception of Cass, of course, and Rusty Rigney, and perhaps a few others I don't remember.